Paige Bueckers didn't hesitate. That's the detail people keep skipping over, but it's the most important part of the entire moment. There was no pause. No, that's a tough one. No diplomatic setup. The question landed, and the answer escaped before it could be filtered. Caitlin Clark. That's it. One name. Immediate. Automatic. And in elite sports, instinctive answers tell you more than any carefully worded explanation ever could. Because when someone responds that fast, they aren't performing. They aren't managing optics. They're reacting from memory, from experience. Then came the laugh. Not the kind of laugh you use to buy time. Not the kind you use to soften a controversial take. It was almost knowing. Like Paige realized mid-sentence that she'd just said something real before remembering how these answers usually go. So she corrected herself. She added another name. She balanced the scales. She did what elite athletes are trained to do. Aaliyah Boston. And again, that wasn't dishonest. Aaliyah Boston is one of the most dominant college players of the last decade. Ignoring her would be absurd. But the sequence mattered. The order mattered. The reflex mattered. Because Caitlin's name came out first, before logic, before PR instincts, before the awareness of how this clip would circulate online. And once you understand who Paige Bueckers is, that moment becomes even louder. Paige has never been careless with her words. From the moment she stepped into the national spotlight, she's been intentional about how she carries herself. She doesn't feed controversy. She doesn't escalate narratives. She doesn't chase viral moments. If anything, she's known for doing the opposite. She redirects praise. She spreads credit. She downplays herself even when the spotlight demands otherwise. That level of control doesn't happen by accident. It comes from growing up in an environment where every answer gets dissected, where one sentence can turn into a headline, where comparison culture never sleeps. And Paige has lived inside that machine for years. From her freshman season at UConn, she wasn't just a player, she was a symbol, a projected face of the sport. A next one, and when injuries entered the picture, that scrutiny only intensified. Suddenly, every performance wasn't just evaluated, it was weighed against expectations, against hype, against what could have been. That kind of pressure changes how you speak. It teaches you restraint. It teaches you awareness. It teaches you how to protect yourself and the people around you. Which is why moments where that restraint slips are so revealing. Because Paige didn't mean to make a statement. She wasn't trying to elevate one player over another. She wasn't trying to rewrite history. She was answering honestly, before she remembered she wasn't supposed to. And the honesty came from experience. Real, uncomfortable, demanding experience. Because playing Caitlin Clark isn't just another matchup. It's not like circling a name on the schedule and moving on. It's the kind of preparation that lingers. The kind that forces you to rethink spacing, timing, and discipline. Elite guards feel it immediately. They feel it the moment Caitlin crosses half court and suddenly the floor stretches in ways it shouldn't. They feel it when help defense starts cheating earlier than usual. They feel it when one deep shot shifts momentum so violently that the crowd doesn't even have time to react before the next possession feels heavier. And that weight doesn't show up in box scores. It shows up in how locked in you have to be. In how quickly one mistake becomes a highlight. In how little margin for error you're allowed. That's the kind of opponent who sticks with you. Not because they embarrassed you. Not because they dominated you. But because they demanded everything you had, mentally and physically, just to stay even. And Paige has faced plenty of elite talent. She's played against future pros. She's played on the biggest stages. She's competed in environments where pressure is the baseline. So when her mind immediately went to Caitlin Clark, that wasn't coincidence. That was recall. That was her brain pulling the file labeled most demanding. And that's what makes this moment different from every comparison debate fans have ever had. Because fans argue hypotheticals. Players remember reality. They remember the possessions that felt longer. They remember the shots that shouldn't have gone in. They remember the way certain players distort the game plan no matter how well prepared you are. And Caitlin does that. Not just with range. Not just with passing. But with confidence that refuses to shrink under pressure. Confidence like that changes games before the tip-off. It changes how teams warm up. It changes how defenders communicate. It changes how coaches scheme. And Paige felt that. Which is why the laugh that followed her answer matters just as much as the answer itself. Because that laugh wasn't discomfort. It wasn't regret. It was recognition. almost like she knew everyone watching would understand exactly why that name came out first. And then, reality returned. She remembered the balance required. She remembered the expectations. She remembered the unspoken rules of answering questions like this. So she expanded the list. And that's where the story becomes less about shade and more about psychology. Because Paige wasn't walking back her truth, she was cushioning it. She was doing what athletes do when they realize honesty might travel further than intended. She was making the answer safer without making it false. But the damage, if you want to call it that, was already done. The instinct was captured. And instincts don't lie. What makes this even more interesting is the timing. This wasn't said during a heated college season. This wasn't said while recruiting narratives were still alive. This wasn't said when conference loyalties or tournament implications were at stake. This came after. After college. After the chapter closed. After the pressure to manage NCAA-era politics faded. And that freedom matters. Because once players move on, the need to protect certain storylines disappears. The stakes shift. The honesty sharpens. Paige doesn't need to protect anything from her college years anymore. She doesn't need to worry about how an answer affects teammates or conference narratives. She can speak from reflection instead of survival. And reflection tends to be clearer, which makes this moment less accidental than it seems. It wasn't Paige choosing drama. It wasn't Paige chasing headlines. It was Paige answering a simple question honestly, and then realizing how revealing that honesty was. And what that honesty exposes isn't rivalry. It's respect. But not the polite, surface-level respect athletes are trained to show. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how hard someone made your job. The kind that doesn't need exaggeration. And that's why this moment resonated. Because it confirmed something many players already knew but rarely said out loud. That Caitlin Clark wasn't just dominant statistically, she was disruptive psychologically. And once that truth slips out, you can't really put it back. But to fully understand why Caitlin had that effect, especially on someone like Paige, you have to look closer at what actually makes her game so exhausting to deal with. Because it's not just the shots. It's everything that happens before them. And that's where the Real story begins. What makes Caitlin Clark different doesn't show up the moment she shoots the ball. That's what most people miss. Fans remember the logo threes. They remember the heat checks. They remember the numbers climbing faster than defenses can react. But players remember something else entirely. They remember the lead-up. Because by the time Caitlin actually lets the ball fly, the damage has usually already been done. Elite defenders talk about preparation in layers. There's physical prep, film, drills, conditioning. And then there's mental prep, anticipation, discipline, restraint. Caitlin attacks that second layer relentlessly. The moment she crosses half court, the game stops feeling normal. Spacing changes. Help defenders inch closer. Communication sharpens. Not because she's about to shoot, but because she might. And that might is exhausting. Most scorers operate within recognizable windows. You know where they're comfortable. You know when they're dangerous. You know when help can recover. Caitlin doesn't respect those boundaries. Her range stretches defensive logic to its breaking point. 30 feet isn't a heat check for her. It's a threat. One that forces defenders to pick her up earlier than they want to, further than they're trained to, and longer than their legs would prefer. And the deeper you guard her, the more space opens behind you. That's the trap. Because the moment you overcommit, she's already reading the floor. She sees the help defender cheat. She sees the rotation coming late. She sees the gap before it even exists. And once she sees it, she doesn't hesitate. That hesitation, or lack of it, is where defenders start losing ground mentally. Paige Bueckers knows that feeling. She's one of the smartest two-way guards of her generation. She reads passing lanes. She anticipates movement. She rarely bites unnecessarily. And yet, against Caitlin, discipline alone isn't enough. Because Caitlin doesn't force mistakes the obvious way. She forces them by making defenders second-guess themselves. Do you step up or stay home? Do you help or trust the rotation? Do you press or contain? Every answer feels slightly wrong. And when every possession feels like a mental quiz, fatigue sets in faster than anyone expects. This is why players don't just describe guarding Caitlin as hard. They describe it as draining. Because even when she's not scoring, she's dictating. Even when she's off the ball, she's bending coverage. Even when she's quiet statistically, the defense is still reacting to her gravity. That kind of presence sticks with opponents long after the game ends. And it's especially taxing for guards. Bigs deal with physical punishment. Guards deal with decision overload. Against Caitlin, guards don't get mental rest. You don't get possessions where you can breathe. You don't get sequences where you relax into the flow of the game. She demands attention every second she's on the floor. And that attention compounds. One deep shot changes how you guard the next possession. One no-look pass makes you hesitate the next time help flashes. One transition pull-up forces you to sprint harder than you want to on the next defensive assignment. Over time, those moments stack. And elite players notice that stack more than anyone else. That's why Paige's answer makes sense when you strip away the noise. She wasn't naming the most decorated opponent. She wasn't ranking resumes. She was recalling who made the game feel the most complicated. And Caitlin does that by refusing to simplify her game. Most players settle into patterns under pressure. Caitlin expands. She leans into chaos. She invites defenders to overthink, and then punishes them when they do. That's not common. That's not teachable. That's instinct mixed with confidence at a level that's hard to prepare for. And confidence is the key word here. Because Caitlin doesn't shoot like someone hoping it goes in. She shoots like someone expecting it to. That difference matters more than people realize. Defenders feel confidence. They sense when a player believes they're inevitable. And when you're guarding someone who thinks every possession belongs to them, the pressure flips. Suddenly, you're not trying to stop them. You're trying not to be the clip everyone replays. That's the weight Paige felt. Not fear, not intimidation, but awareness. Awareness that one lapse becomes a moment. Awareness that effort alone isn't enough. Awareness that you have to be perfect longer than you want to be. And that's why Caitlin stays in players' memories. Not because she overwhelms them physically, but because she challenges their discipline relentlessly. This also explains why Caitlin's impact doesn't always show up the same way on paper. Some games she explodes. Others she facilitates. But even when the numbers vary, the defensive burden stays constant. Opponents never get a night off mentally. And Paige understands that better than most. Because Paige isn't just a scorer. She's a reader. She sees the floor. She understands rhythm. She knows when control matters more than aggression. So when someone disrupts that rhythm consistently, it stands out. And Caitlin does exactly that. She turns every possession into a decision tree with too many branches. She speeds up the game without rushing herself. She forces defenders to operate at her pace, not theirs. And that pace is uncomfortable. That's why guards talk about her differently. That's why preparation feels heavier. That's why film sessions feel longer. And that's why, when Paige's mind searched for the toughest opponent she faced, it didn't scroll through a list of awards. It went straight to the experience that demanded the most from her. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because despite all of this, despite the mental strain, the pressure, the constant attention, Paige and Caitlin were never enemies. They weren't fueled by resentment. They weren't chasing dominance over each other. They weren't trying to tear the other down. Which makes the so-called rivalry people tried to force onto them even stranger. Because what actually existed between them wasn't tension. It was recognition. And once you understand that, the entire narrative around their relationship starts to shift. Because the truth is, the rivalry fans wanted never really existed the way they imagined it. And that story, the one about how comparison replaced conflict, is where things take another turn. The rivalry everyone talked about didn't start on the court. It started in conversations. It started on television panels, social media threads, and debate shows that needed a face, a foil, and a storyline. And Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark fit the template perfectly. Two elite guards. Two generational talents. Two names that drove clicks. That was enough. From the outside, it looked obvious. Fans wanted a rivalry, so one was created. But when you strip away the noise, what's left isn't tension, it's distance. Different conferences, different systems, different circumstances. They weren't seeing each other year after year. They weren't trading shots in regular season grudge matches. They weren't living inside the same competitive ecosystem. Most of their matchups came in rare moments, tournaments, early season showcases, high-visibility games designed specifically because the matchup felt special. And when those moments happened, they carried extra weight, not because the players demanded it, but because the audience did. Every possession was framed as a referendum. Every basket was treated like a statement. Every missed shot became evidence. But here's the part people don't talk about. Paige and Caitlin never asked for that role. They didn't build their identities around outdoing each other. They didn't speak in coded shots. They didn't fuel speculation. If anything, they consistently shut it down. Whenever they were asked directly, the answers were calm, respectful, almost boring. And that bored people. Because boring doesn't trend. What trends is conflict. What trends is comparison. What trends is the idea that one player's success must come at the expense of another's. So the narrative filled the silence. Who's better? Who would you build around? Who shows up more in big moments? Those questions weren't coming from the players. They were coming from a culture that struggles to celebrate excellence without ranking it. And that culture followed both of them everywhere. Paige heard it during her rise at UConn. Caitlin heard it during her historic run at Iowa. Every highlight was compared. Every stat was stacked. Every accolade was weighed. And yet, when you look at how they spoke about each other, something stands out. There was no edge, no bitterness, no dismissal, no attempts to diminish the other's impact. That's because they understood something fans often don't. They weren't playing the same role. Caitlin carried an offense in a way few players ever have. Her team depended on her gravity, her creativity, her audacity. Paige operated within a system that emphasized balance, defense, and shared responsibility. Her brilliance showed up differently, sometimes quieter, sometimes more efficient, sometimes less explosive. Comparing them required ignoring context. But context doesn't drive engagement. Conflict does. And so the rivalry narrative kept growing, even as the players themselves refused to feed it. Which is why Paige's answer in that interview felt so different. Because for once, the narrative didn't come from outside voices. It came from her, unfiltered. And that's what made people uncomfortable. Not because she praised Caitlin, but because she did it without packaging, without framing, without protecting the storyline. She answered as a competitor, not a character. And competitors don't think in rankings. They think in challenges. They think in preparation. They think in pressure. They think in moments where the game demanded more than usual. And Caitlin lived in those moments. That's why Paige's answer wasn't about legacy. It was about experience. But here's another layer most people missed. The rivalry narrative didn't just distort how fans saw them. It distorted how people interpreted respect. Any compliment became suspect. Any praise was framed as political. Any acknowledgement was dissected for hidden meaning. So when Paige spoke positively about Caitlin in the past, it was often dismissed as surface level. She's just being nice. She's saying the right thing. She has to say that. This time, that excuse didn't hold. Because the reaction came too fast. And speed doesn't lie. Which brings us to something even deeper, the psychology of elite competition. Because the players you respect the most aren't always the ones you talk about publicly. They're the ones who force you to grow quietly. The ones who demand more preparation. The ones who don't let you relax. That kind of respect doesn't need to be loud. It shows up in how quickly a name comes to mind. And Paige didn't just name Caitlin. She remembered her. And memory is built through repetition, through moments that leave an imprint. That's why this wasn't about diminishing anyone else. It wasn't about ranking greatness. It was about acknowledging who altered her experience of the game. And that acknowledgement cut through years of noise. But the rivalry narrative didn't just affect fans. It shaped expectations. It shaped coverage. It shaped how every interaction between them was framed. Every glance. Every quote. Every shared court. And yet, behind the scenes, the relationship was far more grounded. They weren't inseparable friends. They weren't rivals locked in competition. They were peers, aware of each other, respectful of each other, and focused on their own paths. That reality doesn't sell easily. So it was ignored. Until a moment like this forced it back into view. And once that truth surfaced, it reframed everything that came before it. Because Paige didn't praise Caitlin to end a rivalry. She revealed that it never existed the way people thought. And that realization changes how you interpret every past debate. But the story doesn't end with college. Because now, both players have moved on. And what happens when manufactured narratives meet real professional environments is where things start to shift again. Because once college politics disappear, honesty becomes easier. And that honesty is starting to show. Something changes when college ends. Not just the schedule. Not just the jersey. The pressure itself changes shape. In college, every word lives inside a system. A system of expectations, recruiting optics, conference loyalties, and storylines that affect more than just the player answering the question. You're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for a program, a fan base, a brand, and sometimes even the sport itself. That weight follows you everywhere. It shapes interviews. It shapes body language. It shapes silence. And Paige Bueckers carried that weight for a long time. From the moment she arrived at UConn, she wasn't just another elite guard. She was positioned as a standard, a continuation of a legacy, a symbol of what the program represented. And when injuries disrupted that narrative, the scrutiny didn't soften, it sharpened. Every return became a test. Every game became a referendum. Every comment became material. That environment doesn't encourage honesty. It encourages caution, which is why most athletes develop a protective layer, a way of answering without revealing too much, a way of acknowledging peers without feeding debates, a way of being respectful while staying non-committal. Paige mastered that balance. But professional basketball changes the equation. Once players move on, the stakes around perception loosen. The recruiting battles are over. The conference narratives dissolve. The urgency to protect certain images fades. And with that shift comes clarity. Players start reflecting instead of reacting. They speak from memory instead of necessity. That's the space Paige is in now. And that's why her answer carried a different weight. Because she wasn't answering as a college representative anymore. She was answering as a competitor looking back. And hindsight is honest. When players reflect on who challenged them the most, they don't think about award ceremonies. They think about film sessions that felt longer. Defensive assignments that demanded full focus. Matchups that lingered in their mind days after the game ended. That's the kind of reflection Paige was doing in that moment. She wasn't trying to define greatness. She was recalling difficulty. And difficulty leaves a clearer imprint than success. This is why elite athletes often speak more openly after chapters close. They're no longer managing active narratives, they're processing past ones. And when Paige said Caitlin Clark's name, she was doing exactly that. She was remembering how the game felt. Not how it looked, not how it was framed, but how it unfolded possession by possession. That's a very different lens. Because in college, perception often outweighs experience. But once you're removed from it, experience takes over. And experience told Paige that Caitlin was different. Not better in an abstract sense, different in impact. Different in how she altered preparation. Different in how she affected spacing. Different in how she demanded attention even when the ball wasn't in her hands. Those are the details players remember. And those details don't need to be defended. They just exist. This post-college freedom also explains the tone of Paige's answer. There was no edge to it. No defensiveness. No sense of competition, just acknowledgement, which is what makes the moment feel grounded instead of dramatic. Because Paige wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't positioning herself. She wasn't engaging in comparison for the sake of ranking. She was answering honestly, and honesty doesn't always come with build-up. Sometimes it comes out fast, and sometimes it surprises even the person saying it. That's why the laugh matters again here. Not as embarrassment, but as realization. A realization that she'd just spoken from instinct instead of intention. And instinct is hard to argue with. This also highlights something important about maturity in elite sports. Early in careers, players are often guarded. They're still defining themselves, still establishing their place, still navigating how they're perceived. Later, that urgency fades. Confidence becomes quieter. Perspective becomes wider. Respect becomes easier to express. Paige is entering that phase. And so is Caitlin. Both have moved beyond college narratives. Both are now evaluated in new environments with new challenges. And that shift removes the need for comparison. There's no longer a reason to frame one against the other. Which makes moments like this cleaner. Paige praising Caitlin doesn't take anything away from her own career. It doesn't threaten her identity. It doesn't undermine her accomplishments. It simply reflects reality. And reality is something players trust more than headlines. This is also why the timing of this interview matters so much. Had this been said years earlier, it would have been dissected differently. It would have sparked debates. It would have been framed as controversy. Now it feels like closure, like a chapter being acknowledged instead of contested. And that's growth, not just for the players, but for the sport. Because women's basketball has reached a point where respect doesn't need to be hidden, where excellence can be acknowledged without fear of backlash, where honesty doesn't immediately turn into hostility. That wasn't always the case. For a long time, attention came with tension. Visibility came with forced narratives. And players had to navigate that carefully. Now there's space for nuance. And Paige used that space. She didn't announce anything groundbreaking. She didn't break news. She didn't redefine history. She simply let the truth slip out. And sometimes that's enough. But there's one more layer to this story. Because moments like this don't just reflect the past, they influence how the future is understood. They reshape how fans interpret what they watched. They validate experiences players couldn't always articulate in the moment. And they leave behind a clearer picture of what real competition looks like. That's where everything comes together. And that's what makes the ending of this story matter more than the beginning. When you strip everything down, Paige Bueckers didn't expose a rivalry. She exposed reality. And reality is often quieter, simpler, and more honest than the stories built around it. For years, people argued about who was better, who mattered more, who would be remembered longer. Those debates filled comment sections and TV segments, but they were never rooted in how the game actually felt to the players involved. Because players don't experience basketball as a ranking system. They experience it as moments. Moments where the margin for error disappears. Moments where preparation either holds or breaks. Moments where one player forces the game to bend around them. That's what Paige responded to. Not a resume. Not a legacy debate. Not a headline. She responded to memory. And memory doesn't care about balance. It cares about impact. The impact Caitlin Clark had wasn't limited to points or assists. It was structural. She altered how teams defended before the ball was even in play. She forced adjustments that lingered long after the possession ended. That kind of presence stays with opponents. And when you hear an elite player acknowledge that, not loudly, not dramatically, but instinctively, it tells you something important. It tells you that greatness is recognized most clearly by those who had to face it. Paige didn't say Caitlin's name to crown her. She said it because her mind went to the hardest test she remembered. The one that demanded the most focus. The one that refused to let her relax. That's not disrespect to anyone else. That's respect in its purest form. And it also reveals something deeper about how competition actually works at the highest level. The players who push you the most aren't always the ones you talk about publicly. They're the ones you quietly prepare for differently. The ones who change how you approach the game. The ones who force growth without saying a word. That's what Caitlin represented to Paige. And that's why the answer came out the way it did. What makes this moment powerful isn't that Paige praised Caitlin. It's that she didn't mean to. There was no build-up. No framing. No strategic phrasing. Just instinct. And instinct bypasses narrative. That's why the laugh mattered. It wasn't embarrassment. It was recognition. Recognition that she'd spoken from experience instead of awareness. And in sports, experience always tells the truth. This moment also reflects how much women's basketball has evolved. There was a time when attention depended on conflict. When narratives had to be exaggerated to draw eyes. When players felt boxed into roles they didn't choose. That era is fading. Now the game can stand on skill. On respect. On stories that don't need villains to be compelling. Paige and Caitlin didn't elevate the sport by tearing each other down. They elevated it by existing at a level that demanded attention, even when they weren't sharing the court. Their journeys ran parallel, not colliding constantly, but influencing the same space. And that influence reshaped how people watched, talked about, and valued the game. So when Paige acknowledged Caitlin as the toughest opponent she faced, she wasn't rewriting history. She was clarifying it. She was reminding people that behind every debate is a lived experience fans never fully see. One built on preparation, pressure, and respect. And that respect doesn't need drama to be meaningful. It just needs honesty. Which is why this moment landed the way it did. Not because it was shocking, but because it felt real. And real moments resonate longer than any hot take ever will. So the next time someone tries to frame their story as rivalry, remember this. Remember how quickly Paige answered. Remember what came out before the filters. Remember that the players themselves often tell the truth without realizing it. And those moments matter more than any argument ever could. Because greatness recognizes greatness, even when it slips out by accident. If you appreciate moments like this, the unscripted ones, the honest ones, the times athletes accidentally tell the truth before the media polish kicks in, then make sure you subscribe. Because these are the stories worth slowing down for.